Welcome to what might be the most complete breakdown of an Ark Raider's life ever put together on YouTube, covering everything from the moment they first suited up to the choices, losses, and brutal realities that defined who they became in a world that had already decided humanity was finished. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So here is why I made this video. I've been sitting with Ark Raiders lore for a long time now, going through every piece of environmental storytelling, every data fragment, every conversation line and background detail I could find. And the more I dug, the more I realised that nobody had actually told the full story of what it means to be a raider from beginning to end. Not just the combat, not just the factions, but the whole arc of a human life inside this world. So I decided to build that story myself, pulling from everything available and making deliberate choices about what to include. One of those choices was to deprioritise the broader political conflicts between surface factions and instead keep the focus tight on the individual raider experience. That meant some macro-level lore got trimmed. But the result is something that actually feels like a complete human story. This is my interpretation, built from fragmented sources, and I'll use language that reflects that throughout. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. Before the Ark, before the Raider. The world that produced Ark Raiders was not a world that collapsed overnight. The evidence scattered across the game's environments suggests a long, grinding deterioration, a slow erosion of the systems that once held civilization together. Data fragments and environmental details point toward a period of cascading failures, each one making the next more likely, each one stripping away another layer of the buffer between ordinary life and catastrophe. The people who would eventually become raiders were, before all of that, just people. They had jobs, families, routines, and expectations about what their futures would look like. The lore suggests that many of them came from backgrounds that were already shaped by hardship. Not all raiders were survivors of some dramatic singular event. Many of them had been grinding through difficult circumstances long before the Ark threat materialized. The cities they grew up in were places under pressure. Resources were tightening, social structures were straining, and the kind of institutional trust that holds communities together was already beginning to fray. The world the Ark arrived into was not a stable one. It was a world that had been weakening for a long time, which is one reason the response to the Ark was so fragmented and ultimately so insufficient. One thing the lore points toward repeatedly is the idea that the people who survived the initial chaos were often those who had already developed a certain kind of adaptability. Not necessarily physically tough people or trained soldiers, though some of them were, but people who had learned through circumstance how to problem solve under pressure, how to manage scarcity, how to keep moving when the path forward was unclear. The communities that would later produce raiders tended to be ones where that kind of adaptive thinking was normalized. Places where you fix things yourself, because nobody was coming to fix them for you. Places where the official channels had long since stopped delivering what they promised. This is not presented as noble in the lore. It is presented as a fact about survival, a pattern in who made it and who did not. The pre-Ark world also had its own stratifications, its own injustices, its own winners and losers. The lore suggests that some of the people who ended up as raiders had been very much on the losing side of that old world, and there is something in the game's environmental storytelling that implies a complicated relationship with what was lost. Not pure grief, but a grief mixed with recognition that the world being mourned was not one that had been particularly kind to everyone in it. Children who grew up in the years just before the Ark's arrival were shaped by a particular kind of ambient anxiety. Adults around them were worried in ways they did not always explain clearly. Institutions were making decisions that felt erratic. The usual markers of stability, steady employment, reliable infrastructure, predictable futures were becoming less reliable. The lore points toward this as a formative experience for many raiders, this childhood spent in a world that felt like it was holding its breath. For others, youth was spent in more isolated communities, places that were already living closer to the edge of what civilization could provide. Rural settlements, former industrial zones, areas that the pre-Ark economy had largely abandoned. The people in these places had a different relationship with scarcity than city dwellers. They already knew what it felt like to be low on the priority list. The lore also points toward a generation of young people who came of age with a very particular skill set, one that would prove accidentally well suited to the Ark world. Technical problem solving, improvised engineering, the ability to work with limited materials, the habits of thinking through contingencies. These were not skills taught in elite institutions. They were skills developed in workshops, in garages, in communities that repaired things instead of replacing them. There is a character type that appears again and again in the background lore of Ark raiders, someone who was already considered a bit rough around the edges by the standards of the old world, a little too self-sufficient, a little too skeptical of official structures. In the world before the Ark, these people were often marginal figures. In the world after, they were exactly what survival looked like. The relationship between pre-Ark society and the people it was losing suggests a system that was producing its own undoing long before the Ark arrived. The people it most failed to integrate, the ones it pushed to the margins, the ones it gave the fewest reasons to defend it, those people ended up being the most equipped to survive its collapse. There were also people who came from much more privileged backgrounds, who had every advantage the old world could offer, and who found themselves completely unequipped for what came after. The lore is not particularly cruel about these people, but it is honest. Some of them adapted. Many did not. The skills that made someone successful in the old world had almost no overlap with the skills that kept someone alive in the new one. The education systems of the pre-Ark world appear in the lore as something that produced technically competent people in narrow specializations, but not necessarily resilient ones. The emphasis on specialization, on fitting into defined roles within large systems, turned out to be a fragility. When the large systems fell apart, the specialists were often lost without the infrastructure that made their specialization meaningful. There are data fragments that point toward people who had been trained as engineers, medical professionals, communications technicians, who found their formal training only partially applicable to the post-Ark world. What saved them, if they were saved, was almost always something adjacent to their training, rather than the training itself. The ability to think in systems, the habit of rigorous troubleshooting, the willingness to try things and observe the results. The social networks people carried with them from before turned out to be enormously important. The lore suggests that isolated individuals, no matter how capable, had significantly lower survival rates than people embedded in small, high-trust communities. The raiders who made it to the point of becoming actual raiders almost always had, at some point in their survival story, a group of people around them. Some of those groups formed organically, neighbours who stayed together when everything fell apart. Others were pre-existing communities, families extended by proximity and shared circumstance. A few were more intentionally assembled, people who recognised each other's usefulness and formed alliances deliberately. The lore treats all of these origins with equal weight. There is no single heroic origin story. There are just patterns in what worked. The emotional texture of this pre-Ark, post-collapse transition period is something the game hints at heavily. There was a period, the lore suggests, that was neither the stable old world nor the eventually organised new one. A period of pure chaos, of grief and terror and constant immediate crisis. Most people who became raiders passed through this period. and it left marks. The specific shape of those marks varied enormously from person to person. Some became harder, more closed off, operating on pure pragmatic logic. Others became more intensely attached to the people around them, having learned in the most visceral possible way how easily everything could be taken. Some developed a dark humour about the situation, a way of narrating the absurdity of their circumstances that kept them from being paralysed by it. The law captures all of these responses. What the law does not suggest is that there was a clean or healthy way to process what happened. The people who became raiders did so carrying significant psychological weight from the transition period. The training they later received, such as it was, focused almost entirely on practical survival skills. Nobody was running therapeutic programs for people whose world had just ended. The communities that formed in the early post-Ark period developed their own rituals and norms for managing collective grief and fear. Some of these were functional, creating structure and meaning in a chaotic situation. Others were less so, systems of denial or projection that held communities together in the short term but created problems later. The law points toward this variation without judging any particular response as definitively correct. Religious and spiritual frameworks appear in the background law as something that people reached for with varying degrees of success. The Ark had effectively shattered the metaphysical assumptions of the pre-Ark world. Whatever people had believed about the relationship between human civilization and the cosmos was now in question. Some belief systems adapted, others collapsed along with everything else. New ones emerged, sometimes useful, sometimes dangerous. The communities that would eventually become raider communities were ones that had found some kind of workable equilibrium. Not happy, not without struggle, but stable enough to plan more than a few days ahead. This stability was precious and precarious, and the people in these communities knew it. The awareness of how easily things could fall apart again was a constant undercurrent. Children born into the post-collapse world grew up with very different assumptions than their parents had carried. They did not have the old world as a reference point. For them, the way things were now was simply the way things were. The law suggests this produced a generation with certain advantages: less grief for what was lost, less psychological dislocation, but also certain absences, less experience of what collective security and genuine institutional trust felt like. The skills transmission within these communities was intensely practical. Knowledge was shared because it was needed, not as an abstract educational project. Children learned by working alongside adults, absorbing the technical and social knowledge required to maintain and defend whatever stable situation their community had managed. To establish, this apprenticeship model is visible throughout the raider background law as formative. There is something in the law that points toward music, storytelling, and art as crucial survival technologies in these communities. Not luxuries, but necessities, ways of processing collective experience, maintaining social cohesion, passing on knowledge in forms that stuck. The raiders, who later demonstrated strong narrative intelligence, who could read a situation quickly and communicate it effectively, often had backgrounds in communities that valued these forms of expression. The physical landscape of the post-Ark world shaped the communities that survived in it. Different terrains produced different survival strategies and different cultural adaptations. Communities in urban ruins had access to material abundance, scavenging from the dense accumulations of the old world, but faced different structural dangers. Communities in more open environments had more agricultural potential, but fewer materials and more exposure. The relationship between different surviving communities during this early period was complicated and variable. Sometimes cooperative, sharing resources and knowledge in ways that benefited everyone. Sometimes competitive, treating other groups as threats to be managed or resources to be exploited. The law does not present either tendency as more natural than the other. Both appeared wherever there were people. The specific communities that would become feeder populations for raider programs were ones that had survived long enough and stabilized enough to start thinking strategically about the future. They had moved past pure day-to-day crisis management and were beginning to make choices that reflected longer-term thinking. Investment in training. Effort put into understanding the Ark threat rather than just reacting to it. Deliberate attempts to connect with other stable communities. Leadership in these communities took many forms. The law suggests no single model worked universally. Charismatic individuals sometimes held things together through force of personality. More distributed decision-making structures sometimes proved more resilient. Technical expertise sometimes translated directly into social authority. In communities shaped by particular pre-Ark cultural backgrounds, traditional authority structures sometimes reasserted themselves. The health landscape of the post-Ark world is touched on in ways that make the baseline human difficulty of this period viscerally clear. Injuries that would have been routine treatments in the old world could be death sentences now. Chronic conditions that had been managed by pharmaceutical supply chains were suddenly unmanaged. The accumulated medical knowledge of the old world survived in fragments, applied by people with varying levels of training to situations those people had never been designed to handle. The raiders who came out of this period and went into formal training had almost universally dealt with serious injury or illness, either their own or someone close to them. Managed under these constrained conditions, the relationship to physical pain and medical limitation that this produced was different from anything the old world had trained people for. A combination of higher tolerance and more careful prevention. You learned not to get hurt, because getting hurt was a different kind of problem than it used to be. The social dynamics around reproduction and family formation in these communities reflected the new reality in ways the law touches on carefully. People formed bonds, had children, built households within whatever structures their communities had developed. But the calculus around these decisions was shaped by survival logic in ways it had not been before. Children were both precious and expensive. Every new person in a community was both a future contributor and a current dependent. The people who eventually entered raider training were often, though not always, those who had chosen or been pushed toward a more mobile, less domestically rooted role within their communities. Not always because they were more capable than others. The law is careful about this, but because the raider role required a particular kind of freedom from obligation that not everyone could have. Having a young family, for example, made the high-risk expeditionary life much harder to sustain. There is something the law points toward in the psychology of people who made this choice, consciously or not, that recurs as a theme. A certain comfort with uncertainty, a preference for action over waiting, a higher tolerance for ambiguity about outcomes. These are not presented as universally admirable traits. In some contexts, they look like recklessness. In others, they look like courage. Often it was genuinely difficult to tell the difference. The communities that produced raiders were also ones that had developed some kind of theory about the Ark itself. Not necessarily a correct one, but some framework for understanding what it was, where it came from, what it wanted, what could be done about it. These theories shaped how raider candidates understood their own role before they ever set foot in a training environment. Some communities had developed essentially defensive theories, viewing raider activity as about protecting their specific community from the Ark. Others had developed more expansive theories about driving the Ark back entirely, about recovering the world. Still others had more transactional frameworks, viewing Ark tech as a resource to be exploited in ways that could benefit whoever could get to it. All of these frameworks showed up in raider programs alongside the people who carried them. The emotional sophistication of people entering raider programs varied enormously. But what the law consistently points toward is a baseline of experienced loss. Everyone had lost people. Everyone had dealt with the kind of grief that comes from watching the world as you knew it stop existing. What varied was how processed that loss was, how much it was still an active wound versus something integrated into a functional, ongoing life. The people who seemed to make the most effective raiders were not necessarily those who had suffered the least. The law suggests almost the opposite, that having had to deal with serious loss and come through it with something like equanimity was actually a predictor of effectiveness in the field. What seemed to matter was not the absence of wound, but the capacity to keep functioning, despite having one. Pre-raider communities also developed their own relationship with the idea of heroism and sacrifice that had significant implications for how individuals understood potential. Raider careers. Some communities maintained essentially martial ideals, celebrating the willingness to risk oneself for the group. Others had developed more utilitarian frameworks where risk-taking was acceptable only when the expected return justified it. These cultural starting points shaped individual motivations in ways that training programs had to account for. The law touches on the gender dynamics of these communities in ways that suggest significant variation. Some communities had reorganized gender roles significantly under pressure of the new reality. Others had reasserted traditional structures, sometimes genuinely by collective choice, sometimes through dynamics that were less voluntary. The raider population, as suggested by the law, was drawn from communities across this spectrum, which produced interestingly mixed dynamics in training and operational contexts. Age was another dimension of variation. Some communities pushed younger people toward the raider path, treating it as a role for those who had not yet accumulated too many local obligations and who had the physical resilience youth provided. Others sent older individuals, people who had accumulated enough experience to be genuinely useful in complex field situations. The law suggests both approaches had merit and both had costs. The specific technical skills people brought to raider training from their pre-training lives were enormously varied. Mechanical aptitude from working on vehicles or infrastructure, medical knowledge from community health roles, communication skills from having been community connectors, combat capability from having defended against both ARC threats and human ones, environmental reading from having navigated the changed landscape. All of these showed up in raider cohorts, and the most effective units were ones that brought them together. The last thing to note about this pre-raider period is the relationship people developed with hope. Not optimism, necessarily. Not a belief that things were definitely going to get better, but hope in the more durable sense, the willingness to continue acting as though the future was worth investing in. The people who maintained this, even in the most difficult circumstances, were the ones who kept making decisions that positioned them for what came next. The ones who lost it entirely tended to stop making those kinds of decisions, and the consequences showed. The world that produced Arc Raiders was not a world that rewarded easy confidence or simple narratives. It was a world that had destroyed easy confidence and simple narratives comprehensively. The people who came out of it still functioning, still oriented toward meaningful action, still able to form bonds and maintain commitments, those people had already demonstrated something important before they ever officially became raiders. They had already shown they could survive the kind of thing that most people in history had never been asked to survive. And that was the foundation everything else was built on. Chapter 2. First Contact and the Shape of the Threat. The moment that divided pre-Arc life from everything after is not described identically across all the lore fragments, which itself points towards something true about it. There was not a single, clean, universally witnessed moment. There were many moments, happening in different places, interpreted in different ways, with different outcomes depending on where you were and what resources you had access to. The Arc's arrival, or more precisely the manifestation of Arc presence, in ways that could not be ignored, happened differently in different places. The law suggests that some communities had warning, fragmentary and unreliable, but warning enough to make some preparations. Others had no warning at all, and the first encounter with the Ark was immediate and catastrophic. The nature of the Ark itself was something that survivors struggled to articulate consistently. The fragments that exist point toward an entity or system or phenomenon. The language keeps being inadequate, that operated on principles that did not map neatly onto any prior. Human category. Not simply a machine. Not simply a natural disaster. Not simply an alien intelligence in any of the ways science fiction had prepared people to conceptualize alien intelligence. What the law most consistently describes is an operational logic that was deeply alien. Not malicious in any comprehensible way, not indifferent in any comprehensible way. Acting according to purposes that were real and consistent, but that defied easy translation into human frameworks of motivation or goal. The people who tried to understand the Ark by assuming it was basically like a military adversary, or basically like a weather system, or basically like a conscious creature with wants, all found their frameworks partially useful and substantially misleading. The first responders to Ark manifestations, in the communities that had any organised response capacity at all, tended to be people with some combination of technical background and willingness to approach unknown danger, not necessarily trained soldiers. The law suggests that rigidly trained military responses to Ark contact often went badly because the training was built for adversaries with comprehensible tactical logic. The Ark did not have comprehensible tactical logic in any familiar sense. The casualties of early Ark encounters were extremely high among people who approached the situation with confident pre-existing frameworks, and much lower, relatively, among people who approached it with more open-ended observation and improvised response. This is not a comfortable finding, and the law does not dress it up. Being trained and prepared was often a disadvantage because the training prepared you for something the Ark was not. The physical effects of Ark presence on the environment are described across multiple fragments in ways that suggest something fundamentally transformative. The Ark did not simply occupy space or destroy things in conventional ways. It changed the physical and perhaps other properties of the areas it moved through. The change zones had their own internal logic, their own strange consistencies. But that logic was not human logic, and reading it correctly required building an entirely new interpretive vocabulary. Survivors who had encountered Ark manifestations and come back generally described going through a significant perceptual recalibration. The first contact was almost always overwhelming sensory overload combined with the complete failure of predictive models. Coming back meant having processed enough of that experience to function in it, or at least near it. Not comfortable, not safe, but functional, in the sense of being able to observe, make decisions, and act on them. The law points toward a particular psychological type that tended to survive early Ark encounters better than average. Not the bravest, not the most physically capable, but people with a specific combination of curiosity and discipline. The ability to be fascinated by something terrifying rather than simply paralyzed by it. The willingness to observe rather than just react. The capacity to hold open questions without resolving them prematurely into false certainty. Communities that had survivors of early Ark encounters possessed an enormous advantage over those that did not. Not because the survivors could tell them exactly what to do, but because they could tell them what it actually felt like, which was information that could not be transmitted in any other way. The physical and psychological reality of Ark contact was so far outside normal human reference that second-hand accounts, however detailed, were significantly less useful than the presence of someone who had been through it. The social status of Ark survivors within their communities was complicated in ways the lore touches on with some care. They were valuable. They were also changed. The experience of serious Ark contact left marks that other people could sense without necessarily being able to articulate. A certain quality of attention. A particular way of processing risk, sometimes a difficulty with the kinds of social interaction that did not carry high stakes, finding small talk and routine social maintenance harder than situations of actual danger. The organisational response to the Ark, such as it was, developed through a period of enormous confusion and competing approaches. The lore suggests that early organised anti-Ark efforts were characterised by exactly the kind of doctrinal rigidity that had cost early responders so heavily. Large, coordinated military efforts based on conventional adversarial logic. Attempts to establish secure perimeters around Ark-affected zones. Infrastructure projects aimed at maintaining the kinds of supply chains that the Ark was comprehensively disrupting. Some of these efforts were not entirely without value. The lore is not dismissive of the people who made them, but the pattern that emerges is of large, organised responses consistently failing to achieve their stated goals, and smaller, more adaptive responses occasionally achieving things that the large efforts could not. The people who noticed this pattern and started building organisational structures around it were the ones who would eventually create the frameworks from which Raider programs emerged. The development of Ark contact protocols, the earliest versions of what would become Raider operational doctrine, was an intensely empirical process. Trial and error in the most literal possible sense, with the error part often meaning someone died. The people building these protocols had to operate without the luxury of controlled experiments or theoretical frameworks. They were building the understanding and the practice at the same time, simultaneously. The fragments describing this developmental period are some of the most compelling in the game's lore because they capture a genuinely unprecedented intellectual challenge. How do you build operational doctrine for a threat that does not behave like any prior threat? How do you train people for encounters that cannot be adequately described to anyone who has not had them? How do you measure progress when the metrics you had developed for measuring military or survival effectiveness simply did not apply? The answers that emerged were provisional, explicitly so. The people developing early Raider doctrine seem to have been very clear in the fragments that capture their thinking that what they were building was not a set of permanent truths, but a set of working hypotheses that would need to be continuously revised in the light of what actually happened. This epistemic humility was not cultural, it was forced on them by the evidence. One of the most significant early discoveries about Ark contact was the relationship between group size and survival rates. The lore points towards small groups, 2 to 4 people in optimal configurations, outperforming both individuals and larger groups in most Ark contact scenarios. Individuals lacked redundancy and cross-checking. Large groups created coordination problems that the Ark environment made catastrophic. Small groups hit a sweet spot of mutual support and operational agility that proved genuinely reliable. This finding had enormous implications for how Raider programs were structured, but it also had a harder implication that the lore acknowledges. Small group effectiveness meant that the relationship quality within those small groups was a primary operational variable. Raid performance was not just a function of individual skill. It was a function of how well the individuals knew and trusted each other, how effectively they could communicate under pressure, how well they could predict each other's responses. This is why the social and psychological dimensions of Raider training became so central, not as secondary considerations, but as primary ones. You could teach someone technical skills. Teaching someone to function as a genuine operational unit with 2 or 3 specific other people required a different kind of investment, one that took significantly longer and could not be shortcut. The first communities to develop something like systematic raider training did so by essentially formalizing what their best Ark survivors had been doing intuitively, watching people who were effective in Ark contact and trying to identify what made them effective. Then building practices that would accelerate the development of those qualities in others. The earliest raider programs were essentially apprenticeship systems with the best existing practitioners. The limitations of this approach were real. Effective Ark contact survivors were not always effective teachers. Some of what made them effective was so deeply embodied or intuitive that they genuinely could not articulate it in ways that transferred. Others could articulate the what without the why, giving trainees rules without frameworks, which worked in situations that matched the rules and failed in situations that did not. The lore points towards some early raider communities developing a distinctive oral culture around these limitations, a tradition of storytelling about Ark contact that was not just informational but was trying to transmit something harder to transmit: the feel of it, the texture of the experience, how the judgment calls actually felt in the moment as opposed to how they looked from the outside afterward. This storytelling culture would become a durable feature of raider communities going forward. What trainees were being prepared for, in concrete terms, was entry into Ark-affected zones for the purpose of recovering materials, mapping the zone's internal logic, disrupting, or exploiting Ark processes where possible, and returning with information and resources. The goal was not to defeat the Ark in any grandiose sense. The goal was operational interaction with the Ark, consistently enough and effectively enough to make it a net positive for the communities that were sponsoring it. The materials available in Ark zones were extraordinarily valuable. Ark technology, partially understood and continuously being studied, offered capabilities that nothing else in the post-collapse world could match. The communities that had access to this technology had significant advantages over those that did not, which created strong incentives to develop more effective raider programs and accept the costs in human terms that those programs entailed. The human costs were real, and the law does not minimize them. The casualty rates of early Ark operations were extremely high by any historical standard. The people building raider programs were making deliberate decisions to send people into situations with very high probabilities of death or severe injury, because the alternative was communities that lacked the resources and knowledge to survive at all. These were not comfortable decisions. The law suggests they were made with full awareness of their weight. The psychological impact on raider program leaders of repeatedly making these decisions was something the law touches on in fragments that feel particularly honest. The cognitive strategies people use to maintain the ability to keep sending people out, the ways they framed the costs, the things they told themselves about necessity and inevitability, the ways these framings sometimes held and sometimes did not. This is not dressed up as heroic. It is described as what it was, a human response to an impossible situation. The people who entered the earliest raider programs entered them with some understanding of what they were signing up for. The survival rates were not hidden from them. This was not a situation where people were deceived about the risks. The choice to become a raider in this early period was a choice made with significant clarity about what it might cost, which says something about the alternatives those people were weighing it against. The Ark itself, over time and with enough observation, revealed patterns that were not obvious in individual contacts but emerged clearly in aggregate data. The law suggests that these patterns were not simple or easy to work with. They were not a code that could be cracked and then reliably exploited. But they were real. The Ark was not purely random. It had structures, behaviors, preferences in the sense of tendencies, operational regularities that a sufficiently experienced raider could learn to read. Learning to read these regularities was the central, ongoing project of raider culture. And it was a project that resisted completion. Just as a community thought it understood something fundamental about Ark behavior, there would be an encounter that violated the established pattern in ways that demanded a revision. The law is consistent on this point. The Ark was never fully legible. The project of understanding it was genuinely open-ended. This persistent incompleteness had specific psychological effects on long-term raiders. The law points toward two divergent responses. One was a kind of permanent productive humility, a settled acknowledgement that the Ark would always be able to surprise you, and that this was the permanent condition of the work. The other was a less healthy form of fixation, a driven attempt to finally achieve the complete understanding that would make the Ark fully predictable, a goal the law suggests was genuinely unachievable. The communities that developed the healthiest long-term raider cultures were ones that had found ways to make peace with the former response, ones that had built norms around acknowledging uncertainty without being paralyzed by it, ones where the admission that you did not fully understand something was treated as information rather than failure. These were not natural human tendencies to maintain under pressure. They had to be deliberately cultivated and reinforced. The material understanding of the Ark accumulated slowly, but did accumulate. Raider communities developed increasingly sophisticated shared knowledge bases about Ark's own characteristics, Ark entity behaviors, Ark technology properties. This knowledge was precious, imperfect, continuously revised, and constantly at risk of being lost with the people who held the most nuanced versions of it. Knowledge preservation became a parallel project to operational development, and the communities that took it seriously had significant advantages over those that did not. The early Ark encounter period ended, to the extent it ended, not with a clear victory or defeat, but with a slow solidification of the new reality. Communities that had organised effective responses to the Ark were still there. Those that had not were gone. The operational logic that had proven effective had become embodied in the institutions, practices, and cultures of the surviving communities, and a new generation of people was growing up for whom all of this was simply how things were. Not a disruption, but a starting point. The shape of the threat, as it was understood by the end of this period, was something that the communities had learnt to live with without learning to master. They knew enough to survive. They knew enough to operate. They did not know enough to solve. And the people who would become the next generation of raiders were the inheritors of both the knowledge and the unresolved problem. Ark raiders as an identity, as a cultural category, as a way of being in the world, had not fully crystallized yet at this point. But its essential elements were all present. The skills, the psychological requirements, the organizational principles, the relationship to uncertainty and loss, and the permanently unfinished work of understanding the thing. That had changed everything. The life of an Ark raider was already taking its definitive shape, even before most of the people who would live it had been born. Chapter 3. The training that breaks you into something better. The formal training of an Ark raider was not designed primarily to teach skills. Skills were part of it, obviously, but the people who built these programs over time came to understand something important. By the time most candidates arrived for training, they already had substantial skills. What they often did not have was the right relationship to failure, to uncertainty, to the specific kinds of fear that Ark contact produced, and to the other people they would need to function alongside. Training was, at its core, about building that relationship. And building it required, almost inevitably, going through a period of having the wrong relationship exposed and worn away. This is why the early weeks of any serious raider training program were almost universally described in survivor accounts as exceptionally difficult in ways that were not purely physical. The physical demands were real. Nobody was going to operate in Ark zones without a significant baseline of physical capability, endurance, strength, pain tolerance, and the ability to function under severe fatigue. Every program addressed this. But the physical training served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was also stress inoculation. It was also a forcing function for the social dynamics of the cohort. It was also a way of getting people to the state where their normal coping mechanisms and self-presentation strategies failed, where you found out who someone actually was when everything else was stripped away. The lore fragments describing training environments are interesting in what they emphasize, not the obstacle courses or the physical tests, the conversations that happened after, the moments when someone who had been presenting as confident and capable fell apart, and what happened next, whether the cohort treated that person with contempt or with something more like recognition that it was going to happen to all of them eventually. The best training programs, the ones that produced the most effective long-term raiders, seem to have been ones that created conditions for exactly this kind of collective vulnerability, and then managed it carefully, not eliminating the hard elements that forced people to their edges, but creating enough of a safety net that being at your edge did not mean being destroyed by it. One consistent feature of successful raider training that the lore points toward was the role of the lead trainer or senior raider in establishing the psychological tone. These were not people who performed toughness. They were people who modeled the actual psychological stance the programs were trying to develop. Comfort with uncertainty, willingness to acknowledge not knowing, genuine respect for art contact as something that remained legitimately frightening no matter how many times you had done it. There is a particular type of experienced raider that appears across multiple lore fragments as a training figure. Not the most decorated, not the one with the highest operational tempo, but the one who had been doing the work for a long time and was still doing it with full engagement, still genuinely curious, still genuinely careful, still able to be moved by the scale of what they were dealing with. These people were extraordinarily valuable as training figures precisely because they demonstrated that the work did not have to destroy you. The training in technical skills, weapons handling, equipment maintenance, arc zone navigation protocols, emergency medical procedures was built on top of this psychological foundation rather than treated as the foundation itself. The lore suggests that programs that inverted this priority, that treated technical skill development as primary and psychological development as secondary, produced raiders who were effective for shorter periods and broke down more completely when they eventually hit their limits. The simulation components of raider training were a persistent challenge for program designers. You could not fully simulate arc contact. The nature of the arc was such that simulation could only approximate some of its properties and completely failed to capture others. But training without any simulation at all put trainees' first real arc contact at full intensity without any preparation, which was clearly worse than imperfect preparation. The solution most programs arrived at, as suggested by the lore, was to use simulation heavily for the things it could teach: procedural skills, coordination protocols, decision making under general stress, while being very explicit with trainees about what simulation could not teach them. Setting expectations carefully. Being honest that no matter how well they had performed in training, first real arc contact would be different in ways that were difficult to anticipate. This honesty about the limits of preparation was itself part of the preparation. It was training trainees to hold their own confidence appropriately, to trust the skills and frameworks they had developed, while remaining genuinely open to the reality being different from any model of it. This is a psychologically sophisticated stance to maintain in high-stakes situations. It requires a particular kind of self-awareness that does not come naturally to everyone. The small group dynamics that were so central to operational effectiveness were a major focus of training programs. Cohorts were broken into small groups early in training and kept together through the entire program. The specific groupings were sometimes done deliberately by program designers based on initial assessments of compatibility and complementarity. Sometimes they were done more randomly, with the logic being that effective raiders needed to be able to work with whoever they were assigned to. Both approaches appeared in the law, with arguments for each. Deliberate grouping tended to produce faster developing units with higher early performance. Random grouping tended to produce more flexible individuals who had better skills for the process of building trust from scratch, a skill that turned out to be important over the course of a long raider career where unit composition changed due to loss and reassignment. The most difficult interpersonal challenge the training programs produced, across all the accounts the law contains, was not conflict between difficult personalities. It was the situation of someone who was excellent as an individual, but could not or would not subordinate their individual judgment to the demands of collective action. People who were genuinely more capable than others in their unit, but whose superior capability made them less willing to defer or follow group decisions they considered suboptimal. This problem appears repeatedly in the law as something training programs struggled to resolve. The capability was real and valuable. The inability to integrate it into collective functioning was a genuine operational liability. Some programs found ways to work with this, channeling it into specific roles that legitimately required individual judgment. Others washed out people with this profile, even when their individual capability was high, on the grounds that the operational liability outweighed the capability. There is also the opposite problem, the person who deferred too readily, who suppressed their own judgment even when it was correct, who needed the social safety of group consensus more than they needed to be right. These people could be more dangerous in certain situations than the overconfident individualist, because they would go along with bad decisions that someone else needed to hear. Challenged. This too was something training programs tried to address. The ideal the programs were aiming for, as the law describes it, was something genuinely hard to achieve. Individual judgment strong enough to override group consensus when the evidence was clear, but disciplined enough to operate within group structures when individual preference and group decision simply disagreed. The difference between the first and second case was not always obvious in the moment. Developing the wisdom to tell them apart was a significant part of what raider training was trying to produce. The physical injuries that occurred during training were a regular feature of the process, not deliberately inflicted, but accepted as an unavoidable cost of preparing people for situations where injury was a constant possibility. How programs handled these injuries was itself informative. Programs that treated injured trainees as liabilities to be cut produced certain kinds of raiders. Programs that treated injury as something to be managed and recovered from while maintaining investment in the person produced different ones. The law suggests that how injury was handled in training shaped how raiders handled it in the field. People who had been treated as disposable when injured in training tended to hide injuries in the field rather than report them, which was genuinely operationally dangerous. People whose programs had treated injury recovery as a collaborative project tended to handle field injuries with more openness and practical effectiveness. Sleep was weaponized in most training programs as a stress testing tool, and the law treats this with something like mixed feelings. It was effective at revealing how people functioned under cognitive impairment. The ability to maintain judgment and operational effectiveness while severely sleep-deprived was a genuinely important capability in a world where operational necessity often did not accommodate adequate sleep. But the chronic sleep deprivation of extended training also produced its own psychological effects that were not always fully recovered from. The psychological content of training, the explicit instruction in the mental frameworks and coping strategies that effective raiders used, was handled very differently across different programs. Some treated it as primary, as explicit as the weapons training, and given similar time and attention. Others treated it as implicit, something you were supposed to absorb from the culture and the modelling of experienced people around you rather than from direct instruction. The law suggests both approaches produced capable raiders, but that the explicit approach was more reliable, less dependent on the specific quality of the experienced people you happened to be surrounded by, more accessible to people who did not intuitively absorb things from cultural osmosis, better at producing shared frameworks that units could actually use as explicit communication tools in the field, saying this is the thing that the training gave us a name for. The graduation experiences that marked the formal completion of raider training were treated with variable levels of ritual significance across different programs. Some were relatively practical: a final assessment exercise, a formal assignment, a handshake. Others involved more elaborate ceremonies, rooted in the specific cultural traditions of the communities the programs came from, or the new traditions the raider communities had developed. What the law consistently points toward, regardless of the specific form the graduation took, was a particular quality in the people who completed it. Not confidence exactly. More like settled readiness, an acknowledgement, usually experienced as both relief and something heavier, that you were now genuinely prepared to go and do the thing, and that being prepared to do it meant fully understanding what it was going to ask of you. The relationships formed in training cohorts were among the most durable in a raider's life, according to the law. The specific intensity of the training experience, the shared vulnerability, the working through of real conflict in constrained conditions, the repeated experience of being genuinely afraid together and continuing anyway, these created bonds that ordinary friendship and even family did not replicate. This is part of why the deaths that came after training, in actual operations, fell so heavily on the survivors. When you lost someone from your training cohort, you lost someone who had known you in a way that very few people could. You lost a particular kind of witness to your own becoming, and the people who made it through full careers were people who had to find ways to carry that kind of accumulated loss without it making the work impossible. There were also training failures. People who entered programs with every reason to believe they could complete them and discovered, through the process, that they could not. The law handles this with care, because the reasons for training failure were not always what they looked like from the outside. People who washed out were not always less capable than people who completed. Sometimes they were more honest about their limits, and the programs they were in had not built enough trust to make that honesty safe. The programs that had the lowest dropout rates were not always the ones producing the most effective raiders. Sometimes high completion rates reflected lowered standards. Sometimes they reflected a culture where people could not afford to show that they were struggling, which meant the struggling was happening invisibly and showing up later in the field in much worse contexts. The most honest training programs, the ones that the law treats with the most evident respect, were the ones that made it possible for people to fail safely and exit with dignity, while simultaneously being rigorous enough that completion meant something real. This balance was genuinely hard to strike and required continuous recalibration as the programs matured. By the end of training, a new raider had been exposed to the full theoretical and simulated picture of what they were about to enter. They had built physical and psychological capabilities that would have been unimaginable to them before they started. They had formed the small group bonds that were central to operational effectiveness. They had been explicitly told, by people who had earned the right to say it, that none of this fully prepared them for the real thing. And they believed it. Not because they were told to, but because the training had been honest with them in so many ways that this honesty, too, carried weight. The uncertainty was real. The preparation was real. Both things were true simultaneously, and sitting with that simultaneous truth was in itself a significant part of what they had learned. The next thing they would do was step into an arc zone for the first time with the people they had trained with, and everything that happened after that was built on this foundation. Every skill they would develop, every loss they would carry, every decision they would make in impossible situations, all of it grew from what the training had planted in me. Months or years before they first saw the Ark for real. Chapter 4. First Operations and what the Ark actually does to you. The first real Ark contact was different for every raider who went through it, and also the same in certain fundamental ways that the law returns to repeatedly. The simulation had approximated the environmental characteristics, it had taught the protocols, it had exposed trainees to high-stress scenarios. What it had not been able to replicate was the specific quality of the Ark's presence on human perception and psychology in ways that the best law fragments describe with striking consistency. The first thing almost every account describes is a quality of attention the Ark demanded, not like the heightened attention of combat with a human adversary, where threat reading is distributed across a familiar range of sensory and social signals. More like a recalibration of the entire perceptual apparatus to a different register, one for which human evolution had provided no preparation. This recalibration was physiologically real, the law suggests. Not metaphorical. The specific sensory profile of Ark zones produced neurological responses that did not map onto established human stress response patterns. The body knew it was in danger, but could not interpret the danger through any of its evolved or learned frameworks. The result was something more disorienting than fear, a kind of fundamental unfamiliarity with one's own sensory experience. Experienced raiders described first-timers going through a predictable sequence on their first real operation. A period of apparent calm that was actually shock. Then, a period of hyper-reactive startle response as the perceptual system tried to compensate for the unfamiliarity. Then, if they made it through without a catastrophic error in either phase, a gradual finding of something like functional orientation. Not comfort. Orientation. The survival of the first operation depended enormously on the unit's management of this sequence in their newest member. Units with good cohort training had built protocols for this. They knew to keep the first timer in the middle of the formation in the initial phase, to feed them clear, simple instructions rather than complex situational assessments, to keep the communication channel open while filtering out anything that was not immediately actionable. The law points toward this first operation management as one of the clearest indicators of unit quality. Not how the experienced members performed individually, how they collectively managed the integration of an inexperienced person while simultaneously doing everything else the operation required. The cognitive load of this was significant, and units that handled it well had developed a kind of spare processing capacity that the best training produced. For the first timer, the experience of being in a real Ark zone was often described later with language that reached for sensation and fell short. The difficulty in describing it accurately was not just a communication failure. It was that the experience genuinely did not fit into existing linguistic categories, and the brain was doing something active when trying to articulate it, reaching for metaphors that were all structurally incorrect in different ways. What most accounts agreed on was that something happened to the normal relationship between time and action. Not that time moved differently in any measurable sense, but that the cognitive processing that connected perception to decision to action was running through a different substrate. Decisions that would normally feel like quick intuitive responses felt slower, more deliberate. Actions that should have required conscious attention happened automatically. The mapping between effort and outcome was unreliable in ways that experienced raiders had learned to work with, but that first-timers had not. The Ark entities themselves, the various manifestations of Ark presence that raiders had to navigate around or through, produced specific responses that the law describes with care. Not simply fear, though fear was there. Something more like the specific discomfort of encountering something that was clearly purposeful but whose purpose you could not read. The Ark entities acted. They had behaviours. Those behaviours were consistent enough to learn from, but sufficiently alien that the learning never became intuitive in the way that learning the behaviour of any biological adversary eventually became intuitive. The first operation also produced the first real encounter with Ark materials in situ, which was different from handling recovered and analysed Ark materials in training. The law points toward a quality of Ark technology in its native environment that did not survive the extraction process intact. Something about the interaction between Ark tech and Ark zones that was genuinely difficult to study from recovered samples. Being in the zone with the technology in place gave experienced raiders information about it that could not be otherwise obtained. For first-timers, this was overwhelming rather than informative. There was too much to process for any of it to be properly received. The first operation was not really about gathering information or mastering anything. It was about surviving the perceptual overload long enough to start building a baseline, a reference point for all subsequent experiences. The first operation was, in some fundamental sense, just about still being there at the end of it. The emotional experience of completing a first operation is described across multiple lore accounts in ways that share certain features, a quality of release that was more physical than emotional, an unexpected difficulty with the transition back out of the zone to the relative safety of the extraction point, a period of apparent dissociation, going through physical procedures automatically while some other part of the mind was still in the zone. Some raiders described their first post-operation sleep as the deepest they had ever experienced. Others described being unable to sleep for extended periods, as the perceptual system continued processing inputs that it had not been able to fully process in real time during the operation. Both responses appear in the lore as normal variations, not indicators of anything concerning. The concerning indicator was the absence of any significant response, the first-timer who claimed to feel fine and appeared genuinely unaffected. That tended to be the person the unit watched most carefully going forward. The debrief process after first operations was handled with significant intentionality by the best unit leaders. Not immediately. There was a standard recovery period before any formal debrief, based on the understanding that trying to access and articulate the experience while still in the acute phase of processing it produced unreliable information and did psychological damage. Time to decompress first, then structured conversation. The structured conversation in good debrief processes was not primarily about operational performance analysis, though that was included. It was more fundamentally about giving the first-timer an opportunity to articulate what had happened to them in a context where experienced people around them could normalize it, fill in gaps, and help build the interpretive framework that would make future operations more manageable. The lore suggests that the difference between raiders who developed well after first contact and those who struggled was often traceable to the quality of this debrief process, not the quality of the operation itself. How well the post-operation processing was supported, whether the first-timer had access to honest conversation with experienced people who could help them understand what they had experienced. The physical recovery from early operations was also more significant than training had quite prepared people for. Not because operations were always more physically demanding than training, though sometimes they were, but because the neurological cost of sustained Ark zone presence was real and required actual recovery time. Units that tried to compress turnaround times on newer raiders discovered this cost empirically, in the form of degraded performance and accelerated psychological wear. The unit dynamics that emerged after first operations were revealing in ways the lore describes with interest. Groups that had trained well together, but had not yet been in a real Ark zone together, discovered whether their training bonds translated into genuine operational trust in the way they needed to. Most of the time they did, with some recalibration. Sometimes the real experience revealed that something important had been missing from the training relationship. The most common discovery was not incompatibility, but recalibration of roles. Someone who had been the natural leader in training turned out to thrive in a different role in actual operations. Someone who had been quiet and apparently less capable in training turned out to have an unusual quality of perceptual processing in arc zones that made them extremely valuable. In the field, the real experience of the arc was a clarifying lens on the group in ways that the best training only approximated. Multiple operations in, the process of developing genuine field experience began, not just accumulating hours in arc zones, which was a necessary but not sufficient condition for development, but building the specific experiential vocabulary that let a raider read a zone with increasing sophistication. Starting to develop the pattern recognition that eventually became something approaching intuition about art behavior, though the experienced raiders who described it almost universally resisted the word intuition as implying a certainty that the experience never actually provided. The lore points toward a particular milestone in this developmental process that most experienced raiders could identify when asked about it. A moment, usually somewhere in the early operations, where the zone stopped being overwhelming and started being legible. Not fully legible, never fully legible, but legible enough to start making genuinely informed judgments rather than just executing procedures and hoping. This transition was described almost uniformly as happening suddenly rather than gradually, a qualitative shift rather than a smooth progression. After this shift, the developmental curve changed character. Progress became less about basic orientation and more about the refinement and deepening of a skill that was already functional. The analogy that appears in multiple lore accounts, used by the raiders themselves, was learning a language. The early phase was about getting to fluency. The later phase was about developing actual command, the ability to think in the language rather than translate into it. The social dimension of early operations was also shaping relationships in ways that would define entire careers. The specific quality of the bonds formed in shared arc contact was different from the training bonds, though it built on them. Something about having faced the arc together, having seen each other at the edges of what human processing could handle, and having continued anyway, created a specific form of trust that was genuinely difficult to establish any other way. This quality of trust was the thing that made effective raider units more than collections of capable individuals, and it was also the thing that made losing members of these units so psychologically costly. When someone who had shared that specific form of arc contact experience was gone, what was lost was not just a colleague or a friend, but someone who carried a particular kind of shared reality that no one else carried in quite the same way. The early operational period ended in the lives of raiders who continued, not with a formal transition, but with a felt one. A moment where you were no longer the newest, where you were no longer being managed by the more experienced people around you, where you had become one of the people managing others through their early experiences. This transition carried its own weight. It meant taking on responsibility for other people's survival in ways that the previous role had not quite demanded. The raiders who handled this transition well were the ones who had internalized, through their own early experiences, what had helped them and what had not. Who could bring genuine presence to the support role rather than just going through the motions of it. Who remembered what it was actually like to be in the zone for the first time and could draw on that memory actively, rather than having it locked away in a compartment where it would not cause discomfort. These people became the continuity of raider culture. Not the most decorated or the most famous in whatever reputation systems their communities maintained, but the ones whose influence shaped generation after generation of new raiders whose specific way of being in the work was transmitted through direct human contact to everyone. Who came after them? The arc did not get easier. The lore is consistent on this point. What changed was not the arc. What changed was the raider. The accumulated experience of repeated contact built something in a person that was not quite adaptation and not quite hardening, but was genuinely different from what they had been before. A capability for functioning in the ark that was specific to the ark and could not be easily transferred to other contexts. This specificity was itself a significant feature of the raider life. The skills you built were not generic. They were profoundly specialized, and this meant that the raider life was not easily exchangeable for other lives, even if you wanted to exchange it. You had become something that was primarily useful in contexts where the ark was present. And those contexts were genuinely not the only contexts in the world. Chapter 5. The weight of what you carry. A raider who had been operating for years was carrying things that did not show up in any formal inventory. Every operation added something. Not always in the way that the popular understanding of trauma described it. The law is careful not to reduce this to simple pathology, but in the way that any sustained encounter with something genuinely difficult and genuinely significant leaves a residue in the person who has sustained it. The specific weight that ark contact accumulated in long-term raiders had characteristics that the law describes through multiple accounts that converge on similar features. A quality of presence that people around them could sense, something in the quality of attention that was different from ordinary human attentiveness. A particular relationship with stillness, with noise, with the specific sensory profile of ordinary safe environments that was coloured by everything the same sensory system had. Processed in ark zones. Sleep was a consistent theme in lore accounts of experienced raiders. Not sleep deprivation, necessarily, but a particular quality of sleep, a changed relationship with the experience of being unconscious that years of ark contact seemed to produce. Some raiders described an inability to fully enter the deep rest that sleep was supposed to provide. Others described unusually vivid processing, dreams that were not quite nightmares, but were clearly doing something specific, working through the perceptual experience of the zones in the relative safety of sleep. The ability to maintain meaningful relationships outside the operational context was something that long-term raiders described in varying ways, but with a common undertone of difficulty. Not impossibility, but the requirement of active effort that ordinary social relationships were not supposed to require. The cognitive and emotional energy that ark contact consumed left less available for the maintenance of the kinds of ordinary human connection that most people could sustain, without conscious effort. This created a centripetal tendency in raider social life, a gravitational pull toward other raiders as the people with whom real communication was possible without exhausting. Translation. Only other people who had sustained ark contact could be talked to without the constant implicit labour of explaining why you were the way you were, why you noticed what you noticed, why certain things that should be easy were genuinely hard. The communities that supported raiders understood this tendency and had developed responses to it that ranged from genuinely supportive to inadvertently damaging. Supportive responses created contexts where raiders could decompress and connect with other raiders without this being treated as clannishness or dysfunction. Damaging responses either pushed raiders to perform normal social functioning they did not have the capacity for, or allowed the raider community to become so insular that individuals lost all connection with the broader human world the work was ostensibly in service of. The best raider communities, according to the law, were ones that had found ways to bridge this gap, where civilian and raider life were genuinely connected rather than sharply separated, where the knowledge and experience of what raiders were dealing with existed in the broader community rather than being sealed inside the operational group. This required sustained effort from both sides, and the communities that achieved it had usually been working at it deliberately for years. The loss that accumulated over a long raider career was genuinely extraordinary by the standards of any other human experience. Not just the deaths, though those were many, and each one carried the specific weight that losing someone who had shared arc contact carried, but the other losses too. People who left the work, for reasons good and bad. The dissolution of specific units that had been genuinely excellent and had stopped existing for reasons beyond anyone's control. The ongoing loss of what the world had been before and continued not to be. The law does not suggest a single healthy way of carrying this weight. What it suggests is a range of approaches that were functional in different combinations, all of them imperfect, all of them requiring maintenance and adjustment as the weight accumulated and the person changed. Some raiders developed a practice of active remembrance, keeping specific memory of the people they had lost alive and present rather than sealed away. This created its own costs, but it also created something that functioned as continuity, a sense of the lost people's continued presence in the work, their influence persisting in the choices and capabilities they had passed on. Others developed what looked more like compartmentalization, the ability to maintain operational focus without the weight of accumulated loss being active in the foreground. This was functional for the work and dangerous for the person, because the compartments had finite capacity and the maintenance of them required energy that gradually reduced. What was available for everything else? The most concerning pattern the law describes was not either of these but a third one, a gradual disconnection from the meaning of the work at a level deeper than the tactical. Raiders who had been doing it for long enough that the question of why no longer felt live, who were continuing out of inertia or habit or the absence of any conceivable alternative rather than from a sense of genuine ongoing purpose. This pattern appeared in the background law as something communities and unit leaders tried to detect and address, with varying success. It was genuinely difficult to distinguish from professional stoicism, from the reasonable and healthy decision to stop dramatizing the weight of the work and just continue carrying it. The difference was ultimately a question of whether the connection to meaning was still there underneath the composure, and that was not always visible from the outside. The physical accumulation of injury and its management was another dimension of what long-term raiders carried. The arc zones were not kind to the human body, even in the absence of direct engagement with arc entities. Exposure to arc-modified environments produced effects that were gradual and cumulative, and that the medical knowledge of the post-collapse world was only partially equipped to address. Long-term raiders who had been active for years carried the physical record of their operations in their bodies. Old injuries managed rather than fully healed. The specific neurological wear of repeated arc contact, the postural and movement patterns that had developed in response to the operational environment and that persisted in safe contexts. The body was a record of the work in ways that could not be entirely concealed even when someone was trying to conceal them. The relationship between long-term raiders and the communities they operated from had its own evolving dynamics. In the early periods of a raider career, there was typically a quality of active investment from the community, genuine interest in and concern for the person going out to do the dangerous thing. Over time, particularly in communities that had many raiders, there was sometimes a drift toward abstraction, where the individual raider became a member of a category rather than a specific person to the people who were not operating. The raiders who navigated this transition healthily were ones who maintained genuine connections with specific people in the broader community, connections that were personal rather than categorical. The ones who did not navigate it well either internalized the abstraction, starting to experience themselves as a category rather than a person, or developed resentment toward the community for something that was a structural tendency rather than a deliberate choice. The question of what a raider was for, beyond the immediate operational purpose of the specific mission, was one that long-term raiders returned to in different ways, at different points in their careers. The early career answer was usually fairly direct. You were doing this because it was necessary and you had the capability to do it and someone had to. The later career answer was often more complicated, shaped by the accumulated weight of years and loss, and the specific understanding of the work that only the work itself could teach. The law suggests that the raiders who found the most sustainable long-term relationship with the work were those who had found ways to hold multiple answers simultaneously. Doing it because it was necessary, because the people you were doing it with made it worth doing, because the specific form of understanding the work had produced in you was genuinely worth having even with all its costs, because the alternative to continuing was not something you could see yourself being. The mentorship relationships that experienced raiders developed with newer ones were one of the primary ways the weight was distributed rather than carried entirely alone. Passing on knowledge and experience was not just valuable for the recipient. The act of transmitting what you had learned, of seeing someone else take it and use it and develop it further, gave the weight a different quality. It became an investment rather than simply a cost. The raiders who were worst at this, who kept everything they had learned sealed inside rather than passing it on, were often the ones who burned out most completely. The law points toward this connection without being heavy-handed about it. The inability to be a mentor was often a symptom of a deeper isolation, and the isolation and the inability to pass things on reinforced each other in a cycle that was genuinely difficult to interrupt. The communities that produced the most durable raiders were ones that had built explicit support for this mentorship function, that treated the transfer of experiential knowledge as a primary operational function rather than an informal side activity, where experienced raiders were given time and support for mentorship work that was treated as real work, where younger raiders were matched with experienced ones in relationships that were actively maintained rather than left to chance. The question of when to stop was one that the law handles with unusual honesty. There was no obvious endpoint built into the raider life, no standard retirement, no moment where the external framework said you had done enough and could stop. The decision to continue was made continuously, each season and each operation representing a renewed choice. And the decision to stop, when it was made against the background of everything that had accumulated. Some raiders stopped because injury made continuing operationally impossible. Some stopped because the community made the decision on their behalf, based on assessments of capability and risk that the individual raider might not have made for themselves. Some stopped because they found another way to serve the work, transitioning into training, logistics, research, roles that used what they had built without the ongoing physical and psychological cost of direct operations, and some simply continued until they could not. The law is honest about this category too. Not with admiration exactly, but with a kind of recognition. These were people for whom the raider life had become the only life, for whom the accumulated weight and the work that gave it meaning had become so entangled that they could not. Imagine separating them. Whether this was strength or inability to imagine alternatives is something the law leaves genuinely open. Chapter 6. The Ark itself. What raiders came to understand across years of operations, across hundreds and eventually thousands of data points, the raider communities and their research has built the most comprehensive understanding of the Ark that existed. Not a complete understanding, not a stable one, but something that was genuinely more than the terrified incomprehension of the early encounter period, and more than the operational rules of thumb that early training programs were built around. The Ark, as the accumulated law presents it, was neither a single entity nor a collection of independent parts. The relationship between its various manifestations seemed to involve a kind of coherence that was not communication exactly, but was not independence either. Individual Ark entities behaved in ways that appeared to be locally determined, but were also consistent with patterns visible at much larger scales. How this coordination happened was something that remained genuinely mysterious even to the most experienced researchers. The relationship between the Ark and the physical environment it moved through was transformative in ways that the law describes as both comprehensible in their mechanics and deeply strange in their implications. The Ark modified the zones it occupied, changed the material and perhaps other properties of the space, created conditions that did not exist naturally anywhere in human experience, and that maintained themselves against entropy in ways that required ongoing energy from somewhere. The energy source of the Ark was a persistent mystery. Early theories about it drawing on conventional energy sources were progressively eliminated by evidence. What remained were theories that pointed towards something more fundamental, something about the relationship between the Ark and the physical substrate of reality that implied capabilities the pre-Ark world had had no theoretical framework for. The intentionality question, whether the Ark had purposes in any meaningful sense, was one that the accumulated Raider experience complicated rather than resolved. The evidence pointed towards something that was clearly more than random. Ark behavior showed goal-directedness at multiple scales. Entities pursued objectives. Zone modifications served functions. Resources were directed toward processes that produced outcomes. But whether any of this constituted purpose in the way humans understood purpose was something experienced raiders disagreed about fundamentally. Some of the most experienced raiders, according to the law, had developed a position that was essentially agnostic on this question, a practical framework that worked with Ark behavior without making any claims about the metaphysical status of the thing producing it. Others had developed strong convictions in one direction or the other, convictions that shaped how they operated in ways that were sometimes productive and sometimes not. The Ark's relationship to human presence in its zones was something that changed in description as experience accumulated. Early accounts suggested something like indifference, Ark entities moving through zones according to their own logic, with humans being essentially irrelevant unless directly in their path. Later, more careful accounts suggested something more complex, a kind of minimal registration of human presence that was too consistent to be random, but too subtle to be clearly reactive. The possibility that the Ark was learning from Ark-Raider interactions, developing more effective responses to the specific operational patterns that Raiders employed, was something that the law treats as a genuine live question with significant implications. If the Ark was adapting to Raiders, then the operational knowledge that Raiders had accumulated was on a timer, valuable now, but becoming less reliable over time as the Ark recalibrated against it. The evidence for this possibility was ambiguous. There were operational sequences that had been highly effective in the early days and became progressively less effective over time. But whether this was the Ark adapting, or simply Raider tactics becoming predictable through repetition, the zones essentially wearing paths in the terrain through which Raiders kept moving, was not clear. The Ark technology that Raiders recovered was, in aggregate, extraordinary. The physical principles it operated on pointed toward an understanding of matter, energy, and information that was significantly more advanced than anything human science had achieved. Studying it had produced genuine breakthroughs in human capability. It had also produced genuine danger, both from the operational risks of handling insufficiently understood technology and from the deeper risk of building human systems around Ark principles before those principles were adequately understood. The communities that had developed the most sophisticated Ark technology integration had gained significant advantages. They had also, the law suggests, developed dependencies on Ark-derived systems that created new vulnerabilities. If the Ark changed in ways that disrupted those systems, or if access to ARC zones was ever cut off, the communities most integrated with ARC technology would be disproportionately affected. This was not a purely theoretical concern. The law points toward instances where ARC zone behavior changed significantly, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently, in ways that disrupted access to previously reliable recovery sites. Communities that had built critical infrastructure around specific zone characteristics found that infrastructure compromised or destroyed when those characteristics shifted. The question of what the ARC was doing in a teleological sense, where it was going, what its presence in this specific region of space and time was in service of, was one that radar researchers approached with genuine intellectual rigor and reached no consensus on. The data was consistent with several fundamentally different interpretive frameworks. Some implied the ARC was doing something that would eventually cease, a process with an endpoint. Others implied ongoing presence without any natural endpoint. Others were genuinely agnostic about temporal scale in ways that made the question feel somewhat meaningless at human timescales. The most experienced raiders tended to have developed personal frameworks for the ARC that were functional rather than explanatory, ways of relating to it that worked for operational purposes without depending on theoretical clarity about its ultimate nature. The law treats these practical philosophies with considerable respect. They were the accumulated wisdom of sustained encounter, not intellectual shortcuts. The relationship between ARC zones and areas outside them was something that became progressively more significant as the zones persisted and expanded. The boundary between ARC-modified and non-modified space was not a clean line. It was a gradient with its own characteristics, a transitional zone that had properties of both states but was fully neither. Learning to read and operate in this gradient space was a specific skill that developed alongside the core ARC zone expertise. The implications of the zone boundaries for community placement and planning were enormous. Communities that had established themselves in what was now transitional space had genuinely difficult choices to make. The law describes instances of communities that chose to stay in proximity to zones for access to ARC materials, accepting the costs of living in an altered environment, and instances of communities that moved, accepting the costs of relocation in order to maintain the kind of stable baseline that proximity to ARC zones made impossible. ARC raiders were, in both cases, the people with the most nuanced understanding of the actual conditions in these transitional spaces. Their operational experience gave them knowledge about the specific characteristics of different zones and different boundaries that was genuinely irreplaceable for community. Planning purposes. The role of experienced raiders as advisors to community leadership was a natural extension of this expertise. The knowledge that raiders carried about the ARC was not evenly distributed. Individuals developed deep expertise in specific zones and specific types of ARC interaction. The aggregate knowledge of a raider community was much larger than any individual's knowledge, and the challenge of effectively aggregating it was real. Record-keeping systems, structured debriefing practices, the cultivation of researchers who could synthesize operational reports into usable knowledge, all of these were important, and all of them were imperfect. The knowledge that was lost when raiders died, particularly those who had been operating in specific zones for many years, was irreplaceable in ways that communities sometimes did not fully appreciate until the loss had already happened. The specific nuanced understanding of a particular zone's behavioral patterns, built up through hundreds of hours of presence and observation, was not adequately captured in any debrief system that existed. Some of it had been passed on through mentorship. Much of it died with the person who had developed it. This created an argument for continuity that operated alongside the argument for rotation and variety in operational assignments. There was genuine value in having specific raiders who had sustained long-term focus on specific zones, whose accumulated knowledge of those zones represented an irreplaceable research investment. Balancing this against the operational risks and psychological costs of this kind of specialization was a persistent challenge. The long-term raiders who had achieved the deepest understanding of specific arc zones were described in the lore as occupying a peculiar position. Their expertise was invaluable. Their continued operation was also increasingly risky, both because sustained arc contact accumulated costs and because they had become knowledge repositories that the communities could not afford to lose. The question of how to use them, whether to pull them from direct operations and deploy them as researchers and advisors, or to keep them in the field where they're specific. Operational expertise was still generating new knowledge, was one that communities handled in varying ways. The most sophisticated understanding of the arc that the lore captures is not a theoretical one. It is the understanding that comes through sustained personal encounter, the knowing how, rather than the knowing that. And this is ultimately what an arc raider's life produces. Not certainty about what the arc is, but a profound, embodied, experientially grounded relationship with it that is genuinely irreplaceable and genuinely costly and genuinely unlike any other form of human knowledge that exists in this world. Chapter 7. Legacy, Loss, and What a Life in the Ark Leaves Behind. The question of what a raider leaves behind is one the lore approaches from multiple angles, none of which feels complete and all of which feel necessary. It is a question about what a life means in a world that has very different relationships with permanence, with legacy, with the kinds of institutional memory that older civilizations had developed to answer it. The most immediate thing a raider leaves behind is operational knowledge, the practical understanding of arc zones and arc behavior that has been accumulated through years of direct contact. Where this knowledge has been effectively passed on through mentorship and documentation, it survives the individual. Where it has not been effectively passed on, its loss is felt quickly and concretely in the performance of operations in zones the lost raider had known. The communities that took knowledge transmission seriously, that treated it as a primary operational function, equal in importance to the operations themselves, tended to develop something like institutional memory of the arc, a continuity of understanding that survived the deaths of individual carriers. This was not perfect and it was not self-maintaining. It required continuous active effort. But it was achievable, and the communities that achieved it had significant advantages. The human legacy of a raider, the impact they had on the specific people around them, was in many ways more durable than the operational legacy. The people who had trained with them, operated with them, been supported by them through difficult experiences, carried those relationships forward in everything they did. Subsequently, a good mentor, a reliable unit partner, someone who had shown what it meant to do this work with full integrity, these influences propagated forward through everyone they had touched. The lore captures this in accounts of raiders who were significantly more senior than the people speaking about them, where the influences still clearly live, not as grief exactly, not as mourning, but as ongoing presence. Something in how the person who was influenced made decisions, handled difficulty, talked about the work, that reflected the specific quality of someone who was no longer there. The communities that had been built around raider operations, that had structured their resource allocation and their social organisation and their planning around the capabilities that raiders provided, faced specific questions when raiders were gone. Not just how to replace the operational function, though that was immediate and practical, but how to maintain the cultural relationship with the work, the knowledge of what it actually cost and what it actually meant, that the presence of experienced raiders had made viscerally clear. There is a tendency the lore describes in communities that had lost experienced raiders particularly in numbers, toward a kind of abstraction of the raider role, a drift toward treating it as a function rather than a form of human experience with specific costs and specific rewards. This abstraction made certain kinds of planning easier, but created dangerous blind spots in how new raiders were developed and sustained. The memorialization practices that raider communities developed were varied and reflected the specific cultural backgrounds of the communities as much as any universal raider. Culture. Some communities maintained explicit records of their dead, ensuring that specific people were not lost to abstraction. Others had more ritual approaches, ceremonies and observances that marked loss collectively without necessarily preserving individual specificity. Others took more practical approaches, attaching the names of the dead to things, operations, equipment, places, in ways that kept them present in the working life of the community. All of these approaches had merit, and all of them had limits. None of them fully solved the problem that the law keeps returning to, that the most important things about a person, the specific texture of their experience and their way of engaging with it, the particular quality of their presence in the work and in the lives of the people around them, were not adequately captured by any commemorative practice. They survived, if they survived, in the changed lives of the people who had known them. The question of what raiders thought their own legacy would be, when they thought about it, which the law suggests was less often than might be expected, the work was too present and too demanding for a lot of abstract reflection, was one that produced a range of answers that the law captures honestly. Some raiders had clear ideas, a specific thing they wanted to pass on, a specific capability they were trying to develop in someone specific, a particular understanding they were working toward in themselves or others. Others had much vaguer senses, that they were contributing to something, that the work mattered in ways that exceeded its immediate operational purpose, that being part of it with full integrity was itself a kind of legacy, even if the specific shape of that legacy was not visible to them. And some, particularly in the later stages of long careers, had found that the question of legacy had become less important than it had seemed when they were younger. Not because nothing mattered, but because the accumulation of experience had produced something that was its own reward, a quality of understanding, of relationship with the arc and with the people doing this work that was complete in itself, rather than pointing towards some future vindication. The world that a raider's life was set against, the world that the ark had made, was not going to return to what it had been before. The law is consistent on this point. Whatever future was being built in the spaces around ark zones and between the surviving communities, it would not be a recovery of the old world. It would be something new, built partly from the old world's remnants and partly from the specific experience of having survived its end. Ark raiders were central to that building, not as heroes in any simple narrative sense, though some of them were heroic in quite specific ways, but as the people who had sustained the most direct engagement with the force that had changed everything, who had built the most sophisticated understanding of it that existed, who had done so at genuine personal cost, and had kept doing it because the alternative was ceding that space entirely to the ark. The communities that would shape whatever came next were the ones that had found ways to sustain this engagement across generations, that had figured out how to develop new raiders while honouring what the previous ones had paid, that had kept the knowledge alive and the practice honest, and the human cost visible rather than abstracted. The individual raider life, taken as a whole, was not a tragedy. The law does not present it as one. It was something more complicated, and in some ways more valuable than tragedy. It was a life organised around a genuine problem, pursued with real skill and real care, sustained by real human bonds and real community, at real cost. A life that produced genuine understanding of something important and contributed genuinely to the survival of the species that produced it, the specific person who had lived it, who had gone from being someone in a collapsing world to a candidate in a training program to a functioning raider to a mentor to someone, whose influence persisted in the work after they were gone. That specific person was not a symbol or a function. They were a human being who had made specific choices in specific circumstances and lived with what those choices cost and what they produced. And that is what the law ultimately offers. Not a legend, not an abstraction, but the trace of a human life in full, lived out in one of the stranger circumstances human history had produced, with the specific combination of skill and grief and genuine understanding and ongoing commitment that this life required. The Ark did not make heroes. It made raiders, and the difference between those two things is everything. You said, continue for an additional 8 hours, the same way continue for an additional 8 hours, the same way 22:15 Claude responded. Chapter 8. The factions that shaped the Raiders. Chapter 8. The factions that shaped the raiders. No raider existed in a vacuum. Every person who ever suited up and walked into an Ark zone was shaped by the organizational structure that trained them, equipped them, and decided what they were supposed to be doing out there. The factions and communities that built raider programs were not neutral backgrounds. They were active forces with their own priorities, their own theories about the Ark, and their own ideas about what a raider was for. Understanding the raider life means understanding these structures, because the structures got inside the people. The earliest organised raider programs emerged from communities that had survived the initial Ark contact period with enough institutional coherence to make deliberate choices about how to respond to the ongoing threat. These were not monolithic. They were diverse in their origins, their resources, their cultural backgrounds, and their theories about what was happening and what should be done about it. The diversity of early raider organisations reflected the diversity of the communities that produced them. Some of the earliest programs were military in character, built by communities that had significant pre-collapse military infrastructure and leadership. These programs tended toward high discipline, clear hierarchy, and operational doctrine built on military frameworks that were partially applicable to Ark operations and partially not. The military programs had genuine strengths: logistics, equipment management, the ability to coordinate large operations, the capacity to enforce the kind of discipline that kept people alive in dangerous environments. The limitations of the military model in Ark contexts were also real and showed up empirically rather than theoretically. Military hierarchies were built around the assumption of commanders with superior information making decisions for subordinates with inferior information. In Ark zones, information was distributed across the unit rather than concentrated at the top, and the person with the most relevant information in a given moment was often not the person with the highest rank. Rigid hierarchy in this context produced bad decisions. The military programs that survived and thrived were the ones that recognized this limitation and adapted. That built-in mechanisms for information to flow upward rapidly, for lower-ranked individuals to have genuine authority to override hierarchy based on direct sensory information. From the zone, for the command structure to flex in ways that conventional military doctrine did not allow. This required cultural change as well as procedural change, which was harder. The research-oriented programs that developed in parallel with the military ones had a different character and different strengths and weaknesses. These were programs built by communities where the primary orientation toward the Ark was intellectual, where the goal was understanding rather than operational control, and where the raider function was conceived primarily as a research delivery mechanism. Get into the zone, gather data, get out. Research-oriented programs produced raiders with extremely sophisticated understanding of specific aspects of Ark behavior. They also produced people who were sometimes dangerously under-equipped for the operational realities of zones, where gathering data and surviving were not always compatible. Objectives. The best research programs found ways to build genuine operational capability alongside the research orientation. Others produced casualties that were uncomfortably high relative to the knowledge returned. The community defense programs were a third type, built by communities whose primary relationship with the raider function was protective. These communities needed raiders not to advance understanding or to achieve broader strategic objectives, but to maintain the safety of specific places and people. Raiders from these programs had a quality of motivation that was direct and specific. They knew exactly who they were protecting and why. The limitation of the community defense orientation was its potential for short-termism. If the goal was protecting a specific community right now, investments that paid off at longer timescales, research, training quality improvements, broader operational capacity building were harder to justify. The communities that managed this tension well, that maintained genuine community defense capability while investing in broader development, tended to produce raiders who had both the grounded motivation of the defense orientation and the broader capability of programs with wider vision. There were also programs that emerged from what might loosely be called scavenger communities, groups whose primary interest in arc zones was material. The technology and resources recoverable from arc zones were enormously valuable, and there were communities that had built their entire economic model around systematic extraction rather than any broader strategic objective. Raiders from these programs were often technically excellent, driven by strong material incentives and operating with a different relationship to risk than raiders from other program types. The ethics of the scavenger orientation were complicated in ways the law handles with care. The communities doing this work were often genuinely desperate, making rational decisions about resource access in a world where resource scarcity was a constant existential pressure. The fact that their orientation was extractive rather than protective or research-oriented did not make them villains. It made them people responding to the constraints of their situation. The tensions between these different program types produced one of the most significant ongoing dynamics in the broader raider world. Communities with different orientations sometimes cooperated, sharing knowledge and resources in ways that benefited everyone. They also competed for access to specific zones, for the scarce human talent that effective raiders represented, for the arc technology that all of them needed and none of them had enough of. The most significant factional conflicts in the raider world were not simple good versus evil narratives. They were conflicts between groups that had legitimate competing interests and different theories about how to advance the situation everyone was facing. The law is careful about this. It is not a story about pure factions doing evil things. It is a story about communities making strategic choices under pressure, some of which aligned with other communities' interests, and some of which did not. Individual raiders navigated these factional realities throughout their careers. The faction you trained with shaped your operational culture, your professional relationships, and your initial understanding of what the work was for. But few raiders spent entire careers without encountering other faction cultures, whether through joint operations, exchange programs, conflict, or the simple reality of operating in a world where different communities were all trying to work out how to survive. The cross-factional relationships that individual raiders developed were often the most informative of their careers. Encountering a raider from a very different program background and discovering that they were effective, that their different approach had genuine merit, that your own factions' assumptions about the right way to do things were not the only reasonable ones, was a significant developmental experience for anyone it happened to. The law suggests that raiders who had genuine cross-factional experience were, on average, both more effective operationally and more difficult to manage institutionally. More effective because they had broader perspective, more difficult because they had seen enough of other approaches to question their own faction's orthodoxies in ways that institutional leadership did not always welcome. The leadership of raider factions was itself a complex subject. The people who ran these programs were making decisions with enormous consequences about resource allocation, about operational priorities, about acceptable risk levels, about the fundamental goals the programs were in service of. Some of them were excellent at this. Some were adequate. Some were doing serious harm through combinations of limited vision, excessive self-interest, or simple bad judgment that their positions insulated them from the immediate consequences of. The raiders who had the most sophisticated understanding of their own factions were usually the ones who had been around long enough to see the gap between the faction's stated values and its actual decisions. These were not always comfortable people to have around. Their honesty about institutional dysfunction was valuable at a systemic level and uncomfortable at a personal level for the leaders whose decisions they were evaluating. The institutional culture of different raider factions shaped the psychological development of the raiders within them in ways that were deep and often not immediately visible. A faction that treated its raiders as assets to be managed produced different people than one that treated them as agents with genuine authority over their own operational decisions. A faction with a culture of honest debrief and institutional learning produced different people than one with a culture of reporting what leadership wanted to hear. The best factional cultures, the ones that the law treats with most evident respect, shared certain features regardless of their operational orientation. They treated their raiders as complete human beings rather than instruments. They maintained genuine transparency about the costs and uncertainties of the work. They created conditions where experience and knowledge were shared rather than hoarded. And they maintained the organizational humility to keep revising their understanding based on what was actually happening, rather than what their doctrine said should be happening. The worst factional cultures, and the law contains examples of these too, were ones that had calcified around specific institutional interests. That treated their raiders as human capital to be extracted from, rather than invested in. That maintained secrecy about operational failures in ways that prevented learning and repeated the same mistakes. That pursued factional competitive advantage in ways that actively harmed the broader goal of understanding and managing the arc. Individual raiders living within these institutional structures had to find their own ways of relating to the culture they were embedded in. Some internalized it completely and became effective representatives of their faction's approach. Others maintained a degree of internal independence, following institutional procedures while holding their own judgments about those procedures. A few became active critics, working from within to change cultures they considered dysfunctional. The question of faction loyalty was one that long-term raiders answered in various ways. Loyalty to the institution that had trained and supported you was real and meaningful. So was the recognition that the institution was not always right, and that primary loyalty to the people you operated with and to the work itself sometimes required prioritizing those over institutional demands. The law presents both forms of loyalty as genuine and the tension between them as real. The factional landscape evolved significantly over the period the law covers. Some early factions consolidated into larger structures, others fragmented. New organizations emerged as communities developed and circumstances changed. The raiders, who lived through multiple phases of this evolution, had an unusually comprehensive perspective on what endured and what turned out to be contingent in the raider world. The enduring things, as the law presents them, were largely at the human scale rather than the institutional one. The specific quality of trust built in good operational units, the accumulated personal knowledge of specific arc zones and behaviors, the mentorship relationships that transferred hard, won understanding across generations. the cultural norms around honesty about uncertainty and respect for the full cost of the work. These survived institutional changes because they lived in people rather than in organizations. The contingent things were the specific organizational forms, the factional identities, the particular doctrines and hierarchies and resource allocation systems. These were responses to specific circumstances that changed with circumstances. Factions that treated their specific organizational form as though it were as fundamental as the work itself tended to make decisions that protected the form at the expense of the purpose. Factions that understood their organizational form as a tool for the work were more able to change it when changing it was the right call. The raiders, who had lived through significant institutional change, who had seen factions they were embedded in transform or dissolve, had a specific kind of wisdom that was valuable. They had learned, experientially, what was actually load-bearing in raider culture, and what was scaffolding that could be changed. This knowledge was not easily transmitted, but it was genuine, and it showed in how they made decisions, and how they navigated new institutional contexts. The factions that shaped Ark Raiders were not just organizational structures. They were cultures, complete systems of value and practice and belief about what mattered and how to pursue it. And like all cultures, they were both enabling and constraining, giving their members powerful tools for making sense of their experience, while also shaping what experiences they had access to, and how they interpreted what they encountered. A raider was always, to some extent, a product of their factional background, and always, to some extent, more than that product. The best raiders were those who had taken what their faction gave them, built on it genuinely, and developed their own perspective that extended beyond it. The faction was the starting point. What happened after was the life. Chapter 9. The Ark Zones themselves, a world within a world. To understand what it meant to live the raider life, you had to understand what the places they entered actually were. The Ark Zones were not simply dangerous areas, they were genuinely different environments, places where the ordinary rules of the physical world had been modified by Ark presence in ways that created something that was neither the old world nor simply a destroyed version of it. The zones were their own thing. And understanding that fully took most raiders years. The most immediate and persistent quality of Ark zones was the sensory displacement. Not that the zones looked alien, though some aspects of them did, but that the relationship between sensory input and reliable interpretation was fundamentally altered. Things that should have meant something specific in normal environments did not mean the same thing in zones. Sound behaved differently. Light had qualities that did not map onto pre-Ark physics. The human perceptual system, tuned by evolution and experience to make reliable inferences from sensory data, was working with data that its inference engines were not calibrated. 4. Experienced raiders built new calibration over time, not replacing the old perceptual frameworks, but adding new ones, developing something like a parallel interpretive system that ran alongside the normal one, specifically for zone environments. This parallel system was not conscious reasoning. It was as automatic and immediate as normal perception, but it had been built from scratch through sustained experience rather than inherited from evolution. The architecture within Ark zones was a particular focus of raider attention, because it was simultaneously useful and unreliable. Pre-collapse structures that had been incorporated into zones were modified by Ark presence in ways that did not follow structural principles. A building that looked stable might not be. A collapsed section might have been reinforced by Ark processes into something genuinely solid. Reading structural integrity in zones required a different skill set than reading it in ordinary damaged environments. The materials that Ark presence created or modified within zones had properties that were among the most studied subjects in raider knowledge bases, Some of these materials were extremely valuable. Some were extremely dangerous. Some appeared valuable and were dangerous in non-obvious ways. Developing the ability to reliably distinguish between these categories was one of the practical skills that made experienced raiders significantly more effective than newer ones, and more survivable. The temporal quality of zones was something that the law describes in ways that are careful to distinguish observed behavior from theoretical interpretation. Time itself did not appear to move differently within zones in any measurable physical sense. But the relationship between events within zones showed patterns that did not occur in non-zone environments. Cause and effect relationships that were unusually direct or unusually disrupted. Processes that seemed to skip intermediate stages. Raiders operating in zones sometimes described a felt quality of temporal displacement that debriefs consistently failed to fully capture. The acoustic properties of zones were practically significant in ways that every experienced raider had to master. Sound propagated differently in different parts of zones in ways that were consistent enough to be mapped but different enough from normal acoustics that the mapping had to be. Built from direct experience. The ability to read acoustic signatures in zones to extract meaningful information from sound that would not carry the same information outside a zone was one of the skills that experienced raiders developed that was almost impossible to describe adequately to someone who had not developed it. The entities present in arc zones were the most directly dangerous element of operations, and the most studied. The taxonomy of arc entities that raider communities had built up over years of observation was extensive and continuously revised. Different types of entities had different behavioral patterns, different relationships to raiders, different capabilities, and different relationships to the zone environments they inhabited. The most common error that newer raiders made with arc entities was applying analogical reasoning that was structurally incorrect, treating an entity whose behavior superficially resembled a hunting animal as though it were a hunting animal led to responses that were tuned for hunting animals and wrong for the arc entity in question. The entities were not animals. They were not robots in any conventional sense. They were not a collection of things for which existing categories were adequate. New raiders had to unlearn as much as they learned. The relationship between different types of arc entities was something that took years of observation to begin understanding, and remained incompletely understood even by the most experienced raider researchers. Some entities appeared to be functionally independent of each other. Others showed coordination patterns that implied something like communication, or at least something that produced functionally similar outcomes to communication. The nature of this coordination was one of the most intensely debated questions in arc research. Some zones had been occupied long enough for raiders to observe multi-generational changes in entity behavior, if generational was even a meaningful concept applied to arc entities. The behavioral patterns of entities in long-established zones were measurably different from patterns in newly established ones. Whether this represented learning, adaptation, or some other process was a question that the evidence had not resolved to any community's satisfaction. The geography of specific zones was something that experienced raiders learned with the thoroughness that pre-collapse maps had never applied to small areas. Every significant feature, every behavioral boundary, every anomalous location where zone properties shifted in ways that had operational implications. This geographic knowledge was deeply personal, built through direct experience, and the loss of it when a long-time zone specialist was killed or incapacitated was an operational loss that went far beyond the loss of the individual. Zone boundaries were not static in most cases. They expanded, contracted, and shifted in ways that were partially predictable and partially not. Communities that had zones near their settlements had to maintain continuous monitoring of boundary behavior because the operational and safety implications of boundary shifts were immediate. The raiders who specialized in boundary assessment and monitoring were doing work that was less dramatic than deep zone operations, but was arguably more directly consequential. For community safety, there were zones that had produced extremely valuable recoverable materials over long periods of time, essentially functioning as resource mines that raider communities had built. Significant operational infrastructure around the long-term operational relationship with these zones had produced very deep zone-specific knowledge. The potential loss of access to these zones through boundary shift, escalation of entity presence, or factional competition was a significant planning concern for the communities that depended on them. The competitive dimension of zone access was one of the persistent sources of factional conflict in the raider world. When multiple communities had overlapping operational interests in the same zone, the management of that overlap ranged from formal cooperation agreements with defined access protocols to outright conflict. The law covers examples of both. The cooperation agreements worked when both communities had enough trust to honour them and enough operational goodwill not to cheat the edges. They broke down when resource pressure was high enough to make short-term cheating seem worth the long-term cost. The deep zones, areas where ARC presence was most concentrated and zone modification most extensive, were the subject of continuous fascination and debate. Operations into deep zones were the highest risk assignments in the raider world, and also, potentially, the highest value ones. The materials available in deep zones were extraordinarily valuable. The behavioral information obtainable from sustained deep zone presence was uniquely informative, and the psychological experience of sustained deep zone exposure was, according to every account the law contains, genuinely different from anything else. The raiders who had significant deep zone experience were recognized within their communities as having undergone something specific that others had not celebrated exactly. The recognition was more careful than celebration, more like the acknowledgement of a particular cost paid and a particular understanding gained. The deep zone veterans were not treated as superhuman. They were treated as people who had been somewhere and come back changed, and whose account of where they had been was worth listening to. The specific nature of the changes that sustained deep zone exposure produced in raiders was something the law describes carefully, precisely because the easy narratives around this were either too dramatic or too dismissive. It was not madness. It was not mystical transformation. It was the specific result of having had a human perceptual and cognitive system engage intensively with an environment that it was not designed for and having been changed by. That engagement in ways that were real and lasting. Zones at night, if night was even a consistent concept within zones, had their own distinct characteristics that added another dimension to the operational complexity. The behavior of ARC entities showed patterns that were correlated with what would be day and night cycles outside the zone, though not always in ways that were intuitively predictable. The sensory environment of zones at night was different from daytime in ways that could be operationally significant. The relationship between weather outside zones and conditions inside them was another area of practical knowledge that experienced raiders built up. External weather did not simply translate into internal zone conditions, but neither was it irrelevant. There were correlations, some understood mechanistically and some simply empirical, between external atmospheric conditions and zone behavior patterns that operationally savvy raiders used in planning. The sounds of zones were something that multiple law accounts describe as having a quality that persisted in memory long after the operation had ended. Not the sounds of ARC entities or structural noise, though those were present. Something more ambient, more pervasive. Something about the acoustic character of modified space that human memory apparently categorized differently from ordinary soundscapes. Raiders who had operated in zones for years sometimes described hearing zone acoustics in dreams, in the boundary between sleep and waking, in moments of deep sensory relaxation. The question of what zones meant beyond their operational reality was one that raider culture approached in various ways. Some communities maintained a strictly practical orientation. Zones were what they were, places where Ark presence had modified the environment in specific ways, and the appropriate relationship with them was operational rather than interpretive. Others had developed more elaborate frameworks, philosophical or spiritual, for understanding what the zones represented in a broader sense. The law treats both orientations with respect, while implying that neither was adequate by itself. Pure operational pragmatism about zones tended to miss things that were visible to people who were willing to think about them more broadly. Elaborate metaphysical frameworks about zones tended to produce confident certainties that the operational evidence consistently failed to support. The most comprehensive understanding of zones seemed to emerge from people who could hold both orientations simultaneously. The changes that zones underwent over their existence, from initial establishment through whatever forms of maturation and evolution they went through, was a subject of ongoing research. The zones that had been present longest were genuinely different from newer zones in ways that had real operational implications. Understanding these developmental patterns was practically important. It was also genuinely intellectually fascinating to the people studying it. The places within zones that had been repeatedly used in operations had their own specific characteristics, accumulated traces of human activity in an environment that was not otherwise shaped by human activity. These places were interesting to experienced raiders in ways that went beyond pure operational utility. They were evidence that humans had been here, had operated here, had survived here, in a place that the Ark had made its own. The long-term fate of Ark zones was something that no raider community had definitive information about. Would they eventually dissipate, stabilize, continue expanding, transform into something qualitatively different from what they currently were? All of these possibilities were represented in the speculative frameworks that raider researchers had developed. None of them had been definitively confirmed or eliminated by observation. This uncertainty about ultimate outcomes was, in the end, characteristic of everything about the Ark. The zones were fully real, fully present, profoundly consequential for every community living near them and every raider entering them, and their ultimate nature and fate remained genuinely open questions even after years of intensive human attention. What the raiders had built in relation to the zones was not a complete understanding. It was a working relationship, an ongoing engagement with something that did not fully yield to understanding, and the specific quality of that engagement, provisional, continuous, grounded in direct experience, maintained despite the absence of certainty, was one of the things that defined what it meant to be a raider. Chapter 10. The things raiders did when they weren't raiding. A significant failure of popular understanding about raiders, the law suggests in various ways, was the tendency to think about them only in operational terms, as if the raider life was purely the time spent in Ark zones, with everything between operations simply being recovery and preparation for the next one. The full reality was more complex and more human than this. Between operations, raiders lived. They ate and slept and maintained their equipment and argued about doctrine and fell in love and had children and planted things and fixed broken infrastructure and told stories and got drunk and cried about people who were gone and worried about people who might go. They were members of communities with all the thickness and specificity that community membership means. The raider life was not just the operations, it was everything the operations were embedded in. The specific shape of raider life between operations varied enormously depending on the community structure, the operational tempo, and the individual's circumstances. In communities with high operational demands and large raider populations, The between operations life might be genuinely brief, a compressed period of recovery, resupply, and debrief before the next assignment. In communities with lower operational tempo, the gaps between operations might be weeks or months long, time enough for substantial engagement with non-operational life. The maintenance of equipment was both a practical requirement and, for many raiders, something that had become meaningful in itself. The relationship between a raider and their equipment was specific and close in a way that pre-collapse professional relationships with tools rarely were. The equipment was what stood between you and death in extremely specific and intimate ways. Maintaining it was not just practical, it was an expression of respect for your own survival and for the safety of the people who depended on you. The communities of people who were not raiders, who were doing the other work that kept communities alive, farming and manufacturing and medical care and child rearing and all. The unglamorous infrastructure of human survival were the people whose world raiders were ostensibly protecting and contributing to. The relationship between raiders and these community members was one of the central human dynamics of the raider world. At its best, this relationship was one of genuine mutual respect and genuine understanding. The non-raider members of communities understood what raiders were doing, understood what it cost, and treated raiders with the specific kind of appreciation that comes from genuinely comprehending what someone else's sacrifice means. The raiders understood that their work was only meaningful because of the community it served, that the operations were not ends in themselves, but were in service of the lives being lived by the people around them. At its worst, the relationship was characterized by a mutual incomprehension that the law captures with some care. Non-raiders, who treated raiders as either heroes performing a glamorous function or as damaged people doing a dangerous job for reasons they could not quite understand. Raiders who had become so habituated to the specific intensity of operational life that ordinary community life felt thin and unreal, who struggled to be genuinely present to the textures of daily life that were not shaped by immediate existential stakes. The children in raider communities grew up with the specific understanding of risk and loss that comes from having raiders as parents, neighbours, community fixtures. The law touches on this with genuine sensitivity. Children in these communities developed early a relationship with the possibility of loss that most children in stable societies were protected from as long as possible. This was genuinely difficult, and it produced a specific kind of early emotional maturity that had both value and costs. Some of those children became raiders themselves, following parents or older siblings or community figures they had admired into the work. Others deliberately chose different paths, either pushed away by having watched the cost too closely or simply called toward different forms of contribution. The communities that had healthy long-term raider programs tended to be ones where both choices were treated with equal respect, where becoming a raider was not the only path. That carried genuine honour. The intellectual life between operations was significant for many raiders. The ongoing project of understanding the Ark was not just an operational function. It was genuinely intellectually engaging to people who had developed the sophistication to appreciate its depth. Many raiders maintained what amounted to research practices between operations, working through observations from their most recent Ark contact, reading whatever theoretical material their community had access to, discussing interpretations with other raiders and with researchers. This intellectual dimension of the raider identity was one of its least visible features from the outside and one of its most important internal features. The image of the raider as pure operator, all physical capability and tactical skill, missed the extent to which effective operation in Ark zones was a deeply intellectual activity. The raiders who were most effective over the longest periods were almost universally also the ones who thought hardest about what they were doing and why it was working or not. Working. The social life of raider communities between operations had its own specific textures. The bonds formed through shared operational experience created social clusters that were natural and strong. But raider communities that became purely insular, where the only meaningful social connections were between raiders, tended to develop cultural pathologies that were bad for everyone in them. The healthiest communities maintained genuine social integration across operational and non-operational members. The celebrations and ceremonies of raider communities, the occasions when the community marked something important together, were occasions for the specific kind of emotional release that the operational tempo and the professional norms around maintained composure made difficult in ordinary time. Funerals and memorials, completions of training, significant operational achievements, weddings and births. These moments had a quality in raider communities that was different from their equivalents in other contexts, more weighted, more deliberately felt. The food cultures of raider communities, which might seem like a minor subject, were actually significant in ways the law touches on. In a world of genuine scarcity, the preparation and sharing of food was one of the primary social technologies for maintaining community cohesion. Meals between operations were occasions for the specific kind of relaxed communal presence that operational contexts never allowed. The care put into food, whatever the community had access to, was care put into the fabric of common life. Sleep between operations, when genuinely available, was both physiologically necessary and psychologically complex for raiders. The body's need for recovery was real, and the operational environment's deprivation of sleep made the availability of genuine rest between operations precious. At the same time, the specific quality of the sleep that many long-term raiders experienced, the processing of arc zone experience in dreams, the difficulty of the full neurological settling that deep rest required meant that sleep between operations was not always fully restorative even when it was available. The physical training that raiders maintained between operations was distinct in character from the pre-training fitness development. It was maintenance work, keeping capabilities that had been developed and that the operations themselves tested but did not always develop further. It was also a form of psychological management, a structured use of physical capability in conditions that were safe and controlled, a way of staying connected to the embodied competence that the operational environment deployed in much higher stakes contexts. The reading and information consumption habits of raiders varied considerably, but the communities that had preserved or rebuilt significant written or recorded knowledge bases had raiders who were intensively engaged with them. The project of understanding the Ark had an intellectual history, accumulated interpretations and theories, and documented observations that raiders who had access to them found genuinely valuable. The relationships between raiders and researchers who were not themselves operational was an interesting dynamic the law describes in multiple contexts. Researchers with theoretical sophistication but no operational experience sometimes had important insights that operationally experienced raiders had missed, because fresh, theoretical eyes could see patterns in the accumulated data that people immersed in the operations had normalized. The best relationships between raiders and researchers were genuinely collaborative, with each side taking the other's perspective seriously. The administrative and organizational work that experienced raiders were often drawn into between operations was not uniformly welcomed, but was genuinely necessary. Planning logistics, reviewing doctrine, managing training programs, contributing to factional decision-making processes. This work required the specific credibility that came from sustained operational experience, and it served important functions. It was also, for many raiders, deeply unsatisfying compared to the work it was in support of. The return to operations after significant time between them was its own distinct experience that the law describes with some care. The perceptual recalibration that Arc contact required happened somewhat less automatically after extended periods outside zones. The specific quality of attention that zone operation demanded had to be deliberately re-engaged. Experienced raiders developed their own pre-operation practices for managing this recalibration personal rituals, and preparation sequences that were partly practical and partly psychological. The non-operational life of a raider was not simply absence of the operational life. It had its own positive content, its own specific rewards and difficulties, its own developmental arc. The raiders who navigated it well were the ones who could be genuinely present to it, who could extract the specific value it offered. The rest, the human connection, the intellectual engagement, without being constantly pulled back in attention to the operational world they had temporarily left. The question of what home meant to a raider was one that the law handles with genuine complexity. The community you operated from was home in a practical sense. The people you were embedded with between operations were home in a human sense. But the arc zones were also, in some important and difficult to articulate way, home in a sense that non-raiders found hard to understand. The specific environment where your most developed capabilities were deployed, where the specific form of understanding your life had produced was actually used, had a quality of belonging that was real, even as it was also dangerous. The recognition that you were more at home in an environment specifically designed to be inhospitable to human life than you were in the ordinary human environments you were supposed to be protecting was not a comfortable recognition. The raiders who acknowledged it honestly tended to do better with it than those who avoided it. What it required was not resolution, not choosing one sense of home over the other, but integration. Finding ways to be genuinely present to the community life and genuinely present to the operational life, without needing either one to be the only real thing. Chapter 11. The moments that changed everything. Every long-term raider, if asked, could identify moments in their career that divided things into before and after. Not just operationally, though some of these moments were operational, but in the deeper sense of moments where something shifted in their understanding, their relationship with the work, their sense of what they were and what they were doing, and why it mattered. These moments are what the law often focuses on most intently, and for good reason. They are where the actual human story of the raider life lives most clearly. The first death of someone close to you in the field was almost universally one of these moments. The law does not dramatize this. It does not need to. The simple fact of it, someone you had trained with, operated alongside, trusted with your life, and trusted yours in return, simply no longer there, was dramatic enough without any embellishment. What the law captures is the specific quality of how this changed people. Some raiders described the first field death as making the work feel more real in a way it had not been before, even after first contact with the arc. The reality of loss grounded the abstraction of risk in a way that no prior briefing about casualty rates had achieved. The work was now not just physically dangerous, it was personally costly in a way that had been intellectually acknowledged but not viscerally understood. Others described their response to first field loss as primarily operational, a recalibration of how they assessed and managed risk in specific situations, driven by the analysis of what had gone wrong and how it could be avoided in future. This was not coldness. It was a way of doing something with the loss that was useful, turning it into knowledge rather than just grief. Both responses appeared in the law, and the raiders who did best long-term were generally those who could access both, rather than being locked into either one. The moment of understanding something fundamental about the arc that you had not understood before was another category of defining moment, not the gradual accumulation of operational knowledge that everyone was continuously doing, but a genuine qualitative shift in understanding, a moment where something clicked in, a way that reorganized a significant portion of what you knew. These moments were described by the raiders who experienced them as genuinely vertiginous, not just intellectually significant, but physically felt, a specific quality of cognitive reorganization that had somatic dimensions. The world was not different afterward. But your relationship to it was, and in contexts where how you related to the world you were operating in was literally a survival variable, this felt like a significant change. The moments of genuine operational excellence, when everything went right in a high-difficulty situation, were also formative in their own way. The experience of a unit functioning at its absolute peak, where the collective performance was something none of the individuals could have achieved separately, where the coordination was perfect and the reading of the environment was accurate and the decisions under pressure were right, produced a specific quality of exhilaration that was unlike any other experience the raider life offered. These moments were rare, and the lore suggests they were precious precisely because of their rarity. They were evidence of what the work could be at its best. They were experiences that reaffirmed the investment in the demanding process of building genuine unit trust and operational sophistication. And they were, almost always, also moments that were immediately followed by the humility of knowing that the next operation would be harder and less perfect. The moments of genuine failure, not the routine difficulties that every operation contained, but the failures that mattered, where something went badly wrong in ways that had real consequences, were perhaps the most formative moments of all. The lore handles these with particular care, not to assign blame, though sometimes blame was genuinely assignable, but to understand what they meant in the deeper sense. The raiders who grew most from significant operational failures were those who could engage with them fully without either self-exoneration or collapse into self-recrimination, who could look at what happened, assess their own role honestly, identify what had been within their control and what had not, extract whatever was learnable, and carry forward, without being paralyzed. This was a sophisticated capacity, and it was not automatic. It was something that had to be developed, often through the experience of getting it wrong first. The moment of recognizing that someone who had been a role model or mentor was not who you had thought they were, was another category of defining experience. The lore contains accounts of raiders who had looked up to specific experienced people as models of what the work should look like, and who had later discovered that those people had significant failures of integrity, judgment, or character that their competence had obscured. These discoveries were genuinely difficult, not because disillusionment was unusual or surprising in principle, but because in the specific context of the raider world, where the credibility of experienced people was the primary transmission mechanism for the most important cultural and operational knowledge, having that credibility undermined was not just personally painful. It created legitimate uncertainty about what else that person had modelled that was also unreliable. The productive response to this kind of disillusionment was a more discriminating relationship with authority and expertise generally. Not cynicism, not the conclusion that no one could be trusted, but the recognition that capability in one dimension did not imply integrity across all dimensions, and that the most valuable thing about experienced raiders was not their authority, but the specific experiential knowledge they had built, which could be evaluated independently of the person's overall integrity. The moments of encountering something in the arc that genuinely exceeded any existing framework for interpretation were a specific category that the lore treats with unusual seriousness. Not just the ordinary difficulty of arc interpretation that every raider lived with, but encounters with something that was genuinely beyond the current interpretive toolkit, that required not just the application of existing frameworks, but the building of new ones from scratch. These encounters were reported with a consistency that suggested they were real, and not simply psychological artifacts of high-stress situations, something in the arc zones that periodically produced experiences that pushed against the edges of the most sophisticated existing understanding. Raiders who had these experiences were changed by them, not into certainty about any specific interpretation, but into a quality of openness to the arc's fundamental strangeness. That was different from the more operational relationship with it that day-to-day work produced. The moment of choosing to stay in the work when you genuinely could have stopped was for many raiders the most significant defining moment of their careers, because it was a moment of genuine agency. Everything before it could be understood as responding to circumstances. This was different. This was a decision made in full knowledge of what the work was, what it cost, and what the alternatives were. The reasons people gave for this choice were as varied as the people giving them. The relationships with specific people who were continuing, the sense of unfinished business with specific arc zones or specific operational challenges. The recognition that whatever they had built through years of the work was not transferable to any other context, and that leaving would mean leaving behind the most developed version of themselves. The simple fact of not having anywhere else to go that felt real. None of these reasons were presented in the law as obviously right. The decision to stay and the decision to leave were both defensible. What was notable about the moment of the choice was that it was being made consciously, with full information, by someone who had earned the right to make it. Whatever they decided after that point was a genuine expression of who they were. The moments that happened at the ends of careers, whether those ends were deaths in the field, incapacitation by injury or arc exposure, or deliberate choice to step away, were handled in the law with the full weight they deserved. These were not just operational transitions. They were the completion of something that had been building across an entire adult life. The raiders who died in the field in the line of their work died as themselves, as the most complete versions of the specific person they had become through the work. This is not presented as comfort exactly, but it is presented as something real. There was an integrity to it that the law acknowledges without romanticizing. The raiders who lived to step away from active operations, who found themselves at the end of the operational part of their lives with more of their lives still ahead, faced a different and in some ways harder challenge. Who were you when the thing that had most defined you was no longer what you were doing? The law does not offer easy answers to this. It offers accounts of people working through it in different ways, with different degrees of success, all of them real. The moments between the big defining moments, the ordinary days and operations and maintenance and conversations that made up the bulk of a raider career, were what the big moments were embedded in. And the law suggests that this ordinary texture of the life was itself a significant part of what made it meaningful. Not just the dramatic moments, the sustained daily practice of the work, the small choices made repeatedly, the ongoing maintenance of the specific quality of attention and integrity and presence that the work required. A life was not its peak moments. A life was the whole texture of how it was lived, and the raider life, at its best, was one lived with full engagement across that whole texture, not just at the dramatic points, but in the ordinary accumulation of days that gave the dramatic points their context and their meaning. Chapter 12. The Ark Raider at the end of the world they made. What did all of it add up to? This is the question that the law circles around in its final registers, approaching it from different angles, through different voices, never quite landing on a single answer. Which is itself a kind of answer. The world the Ark Raiders inhabited and shaped was genuinely different from any prior human world. Not just in the obvious catastrophic sense of the Ark's presence, but in the specific adaptive forms that human communities had developed in response to it. The culture, the knowledge, the organisational forms, the psychological frameworks. All of it was new, in important ways. And the raiders were central to building it, not by themselves, but as the people whose sustained engagement with the Ark provided the communities around them with the information and resources and demonstrated possibility that all of this building required. The knowledge base that accumulated raider experience had built over the period the lore covers was extraordinary in scale and depth. Not complete. Never complete. But genuine. It represented the most serious, sustained human engagement with the most significant challenge human civilization had ever faced, conducted by people who had paid for every piece of understanding with the specific currency of repeated personal risk and loss. The communities that had developed most fully around raider operations were communities with specific cultural characteristics that the lore treats as genuinely valuable. A comfort with uncertainty that the pre-Ark world had not particularly cultivated, a pragmatic relationship with theoretical frameworks, using them as tools rather than treating them as truth. A cultural norm around honesty about difficulty and cost that the pre-Ark tendency to institutional cheerfulness had generally suppressed. A quality of genuine solidarity built through shared serious experience rather than the more superficial solidarity of shared interest or convenience. These cultural characteristics were not cost-free. The comfort with uncertainty came with a certain difficulty with the kinds of confident long-term planning that stable societies depended on. The pragmatic relationship with theory could slide into anti-intellectualism if not carefully maintained. The honesty about difficulty could become a culture of complaint. The solidarity built through shared hardship was expensive and had been paid for in real human cost. But the lore does present these as genuine achievements, things that the specific circumstances of the Ark world had forced the development of and that were genuinely valuable for the ongoing project of human survival and human flourishing under genuinely difficult conditions. The individual Ark raider, standing at the end of a career that had taken them from whatever they were before through training and operations and loss and understanding and more. Loss and more understanding was a specific kind of human being that the old world had not produced and could not have produced. Not better in any abstract sense, but specifically adapted, specifically developed, specifically equipped for the specific world they had lived in. The specificity was both the limitation and the achievement. You could not easily take what an experienced raider had built in themselves and translate it wholesale into any other context. The understanding was too particular, too grounded in the specific experience of specific Ark zones in a specific period of a specific world. But within its own context, it was real and deep and genuinely hard-won. The Ark itself had not changed in any fundamental way that the lore can point to over the period it covers. It was still there, still operating according to purposes that remained incompletely understood, still modifying the zones it occupied in ways that continued to demand engagement and adaptation. The human relationship with it had changed enormously. The Ark itself remained something that was not fully knowable through any human approach available. This is where the raiders lived, in the space between human capacity and the Ark's fundamental resistance to being fully understood. And the quality of life that was possible in that space, the specific form of meaningful engagement it allowed, was something that could only be assessed by the people who had lived it. The law does not offer a verdict on whether those lives were well spent in some universal sense. It does not need to. What it offers instead is the full texture of those lives, the cost and the reward, the loss and the understanding, the bonds formed and broken, the knowledge built and sometimes lost, the moments of genuine excellence and genuine failure, the ordinary days and the extraordinary ones. And in that full texture, without any editorial verdict, the lives speak for themselves.